Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I am taking a look at this Balaur Arms single-edged Viking sword. Now before I get started, a little bit of background about this sword. I bought it secondhand, and it originally sold for around $250. I don't remember the exact price. It did come completely blunt, and I sent it to my friend Matthew Cross of Real Swords to sharpen it for me. While Balaur Arms, the sword was made by the company OTC, which was the original source for Balaur Arms swords. Check out my review of the LK Chen Balaur Arms collaboration Italian longsword, linked up here, for a bit more details about all of that. Now this one is a discontinued model. You can't buy it from Balaur Arms anymore. However, Cold Steel has one that is very similar. I'm pretty confident it's basically the exact same model and specs and everything, and OTC makes it for Cold Steel now. Cold Steel has the MSRP of that sword at $260, but listed as out of stock. Kult of Athena does have it in stock, but at $320. I put a link in the description to the Kult of Athena listing without my affiliate code. If you do want to use my affiliate code to buy it, or really any way to support my channel, I have a whole section in the description about various ways you can do so. Let's take a look at the scabbard. This has been customized by a previous owner. The belt suspension system and the wool is not stock. He added those and ended up selling it. I think this has been sold a couple times actually. The base scabbard is a wood core with a leather wrap and a very shiny shape that I wish was a little less shiny to match the hilt furniture a bit better. The stitching on the back is relatively prominent, but it's not rough. It doesn't feel like it doesn't rub against the fingers wrong. It has a couple rain flaps. I happen to love rain flaps on scabbards. Pretty much all of the scabbards I would want would have those on there, and they're done pretty well. As for the customizations, I really like what the previous owner did here. The wool gives it kind of like a primal, raw look, something that evokes the spirit of Vikings, even though it probably is not at all historically accurate, I would guess. That's just my opinion. I am not a Viking scholar in the slightest, so I don't know that for sure. I just feel like you see a lot of stuff in Hollywood about Vikings and fur and wearing stuff like that, and I don't think that was accurate. But regardless, it still gives a really cool look. And also the belt shape and the buckle have this nice intricate knot work on them that also evokes Vikings and probably a bit more accurate than the wool. Now the wool additions are attached by, looks like some basic cord, and if you look on the back you can see it doesn't go all the way around, and there's actually some cellophane tape here. I'm pretty sure the individual who customized this, I think this was one of his first scabbard customizations, and I'm not reviewing the customizations. It's just something I thought I should mention because, you know, it's very obviously on the scabbard. As for the fit of the scabbard, it's actually pretty tight. I can hold it upside down and shake and it doesn't come out. There's absolutely no rattle, and I have to actually tug on it a bit more than I would like to get it to come out. This is, of course, affected by climate, and I think at different times of the year I've had an easier time getting this out. So again, climate makes a difference. The weather, the temperature, the humidity, all that kind of thing can make a difference in the fit of the sword to the scabbard. Let's take a look at the hilt of the sword, starting with the crossguard. This is what I would consider to be a pretty basic guard, but it does have some dimension to it. It tapers in thickness out towards the ends, which is something you will see missed on a lot of budget swords. The finish on it is kind of a modern satin, I think is the way I would call it, because you can still see some of the grind lines and they have a machined look to them. It's not particularly bad, but it is a modern appearance to me. The gap in the crossguard is very rectangularly shaped. It's not really shaped to the blade at all. That said, it's not really egregious. It's fit on the edges of the sword well. It's just on the planes, it's a bit more of a gap than you could have. That said, this is a very inexpensive sword, so you don't really expect a ton of detail there. The edges of the crossguard are all chamfered nicely, and I don't feel any discomfort when my hand bumps up against it. The grip is quite simple but effective. It starts a little thicker at the crossguard and tapers in thickness towards the pommel. There's a nice even cord wrap with no risers and a seam that's pretty straight and very slightly noticeable by touch. This is something that the original maker OTC does very well in the budget range, is the grips. It's something that a lot of companies in the budget range don't really do very well. I'm looking at you, Windlass. This is a much better grip than you'll find on a lot of budget swords. The grip is just under 3 3/4 inches long, which is rather short for what most people consider to be comfortable. This is, however, historically accurate for Viking swords, and honestly, it could actually even be shorter. That does cause some issues when using the sword, but we'll get into that a lot more in the handling section. The pommel is finished just like the crossguard with that modern satin look. Historically, this type of pommel would be two-piece. This little bar right here would be pinned to the tang, and then the cap would be riveted to the bottom bar piece. Now this one, it's really hard to tell if it's actually two-piece. It has what looks like copper rivets here, but they could just be inlay. There's really no way for me to tell that I'm aware of. So while I would like to say that this is properly constructed as a two-piece pommel, I just don't know for sure. There's a twisted copper wire that lays in the seam between what would be the two parts, and I really like this look. I love the look of copper as an accent in sword hilts, and it looks great here. And one thing that probably doesn't come across when just looking at profile pictures of this sword is the size of the pommel. Now, just looking at it straight on, it looks huge and heavy and unwieldable, but it's not. It's actually quite slender, and it's another thing that shows some attention to detail here, because it starts thick here and then thins out towards the end of the pommel. This keeps this massive looking pommel from being a huge weight on the end of the sword. Now the edges are not chamfered as well as the crossguard. They are chamfered, I can feel them, but they aren't quite as chamfered. And again, this can cause some issues with wielding the sword, but again, we're going to get into that in the handling section. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So it's a 30-inch blade that starts about 2 inches wide with very gentle profile taper until it reaches the curve into the tip. The thickness at the crossguard and for the first 6 inches is 4.5 millimeters, and then it starts gradually tapering to 3.8 millimeters at 18 inches up the blade, before rapidly tapering down to 2.4 millimeters right before the tip. The sword weighs in at 2 pounds 6 ounces, and it's balanced at nearly 7 inches from the guard. The blade features a wide fuller that goes the entire length of the blade, and it starts from the spine and goes to about 3/8 of an inch from the edge. The edge of the fuller is not particularly crisp, but it doesn't need to be. Although it does waver around a little bit, you should be able to see that here. And if you look down the length of the blade in the right light, you can definitely see a decent amount of rippling on the blade. It's not egregious, and it doesn't really cause issues, but it is there, it's noticeable, it could be improved. The spine also, you can feel those ripples. If I just run my fingers along the spine like this, I can feel the slight unevenness of the thickness. It's, again, not a big deal, but it is something to point out. Now, as I mentioned, the sword did come blunt, and when I say blunt, I mean blunt. This thing came with around a 2 millimeter thick edge, which is a lot of metal to get through to get it sharp. I had my friend Matthew Cross of Real Swords, link in the description to his YouTube channel, sharpen it for me, and there's a lot of grinding to do to get it sharp. Now, he managed to put on a very nice apple-seeded edge here, but the amount of grinding means that there's a good amount of grind lines visible from him sharpening it. Now, frankly, since the sword has that kind of modern satin look that I mentioned earlier, it doesn't look out of place, and these grind lines don't bother me. And frankly, after I cut tatami, there's a good number of scratches on the blade anyways, so it doesn't really matter. I should also mention that there's a few black spots here and there on the blade. They're pretty small. They don't look like rust or anything like that, probably just very minor imperfections in the steel. So let's do some paper cutting. Now, I am not really testing the sword here so much because it doesn't come sharp. My friend Matthew Cross sharpened it for me. But this is still instructive so we know how sharp it is. So when I go out and do cutting targets, we can judge how it cuts based on the sharpness that we know it has. So that was very smooth, very even until we got up right around here, which you don't really want to cut there anyway, so that's fine. Yeah, this is absolutely paper cutting sharp. In fact, when Matthew Cross sent it to me, he sent me a picture or a video of him cutting some bunched up paper towels and just slicing right through it. I know this sword is very sharp. Let's take a look at some cutting footage. Once again, I did water bottles, pool noodles, and tatami. Let's start with the water bottles. So overall, the sword cuts water bottles quite well, which is not really a surprise because it is quite sharp. And that's one of the primary things that you want for cutting water bottles. I was able to get some silent cuts, not a lot, but it's not surprising that I was not able to get a lot because I am not at all practiced with this type of sword. I am very much more practiced with long swords, with katana, even with arming swords. Viking style sword is a whole different beast, and more use would get me to better cuts out of this, I am sure. But even still, it was very effective at water bottle cutting. And that brings me to pool noodles, and this sword failed miserably. Now, part of that's going to be my fault. When you're looking at this footage, some of these cuts are too slow. That's just a fact of life. I was not particularly effective when I was doing that. But some of the cuts were fast enough with good enough edge alignment, and this sword is sharp enough to cut pool noodles. I know it is. So why did it fail? Well, I think it has to do with the primary edge bevel being so short. When you look at the edge, from the fuller to the edge is only 3/8 of an inch. That's not a lot of room to get all the way to the sharp edge. So the geometry is not particularly conducive to cutting. And that brings me to tatami. And just like the pool noodles, I really struggled with this sword. Some of this, again, is my fault. I was really trying to make the speed not a problem, so I was putting a lot of oomph into the cuts. I don't think my speed was a problem. My edge alignment on some of these cuts was definitely a problem. There was at least one cut where I was just way off, and the sword ended up cutting down into the tatami after biting into it. But other of these cuts were quite good. They were fast, the edge was on point, and it still struggled to get all the way through. In fact, I never got one cut all the way through the tatami. I think there's two reasons for this. The first one, and I think this is a lesser reason, but it is a reason, is that the tip of the spike the tatami sits on actually broke off into the tatami when I was spiking it. I didn't realize that until after it came off and I restaked it once or twice. And then I looked and I was like, wait a minute, where's the rest of the tip? So what that did was make the tatami not be as stable on the stand. So it didn't resist the cut as well. And it didn't stay in place as well for the cut, and therefore more of the force kind of pushed it aside. However, that's, I think, the smaller portion of it, because the real issue, I think, is, again, the edge bevel. It's not that it's not sharp enough. It is most definitely sharp enough to cut tatami, but 3/8 of an inch at the sweet spot to the edge. That's not very much of an edge bevel, and it's about 3.5 millimeters thick here. So we're talking like about that much room to go from 3.5 millimeters all the way down to the edge. If you think about a long sword with that geometry, that is not a very wide blade. You're not going to have particularly great cutter with that kind of geometry. It's just not really designed for that. What it is designed for is powerful chopping. This sword, when I throw it out there, it has a lot of authority in the cut. And it did chop into the tatami. It just didn't go all the way through. It's much more conducive of a chopping attack than it is of a slicing. And honestly, I think that makes sense because the edge bevel is almost axe-like in its shape. And, axes are more for chopping. That's not to say they can't cut, they can't slice, but generally speaking, they're more for chopping. And this sword, after using it on multiple targets, I really do feel like it is more of a chopper than it is a cutter. All right, so handling. Now I mentioned earlier that I would talk about the grip and the pommel in this section. So here we go, let's start with that. The grip is a little bit short for modern hands. However, Viking swords were typically pretty short gripped, and it causes a lot of problems for people who aren't quite sure how to use Viking swords. Now, we don't have any manuscripts, any techniques described to us, so it's kind of just something that people have had to develop and intuit. Now, there's basically two ideas here. One would be the hammer grip, where you basically grip the sword just like a hammer. When you do this, if you cut and you extend the wrist, the pommel ends up biting into your hand quite badly. Like, I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but it's already starting to biting a little bit. It doesn't hurt particularly much when I'm just doing this. It just feels a little uncomfortable. But when you're swinging and it bites into your hand like that, it feels really bad. I tried one cut with a hammer grip and I just stopped immediately after because it hurt quite a bit. Now you can do something more like a tulwar grip where you do completely draw cuts with a hammer grip on this, and that's going to work. But I did try that a little bit also, and it didn't feel good. It didn't feel as natural as doing it with a tulwar. So the other grip is going to be more of a handshake grip, and this is pretty much the type of grip that I use on my swords most of the time. And it's kind of bringing the hand back a little bit and letting the pommel rest in the palm of the hand. So when you extend the wrist, it doesn't bite in. It will slide up the palm a little bit. Now it does kind of still indent on the skin a little bit here, if you can see that. But when I cut like this, there's absolutely no biting. It doesn't feel uncomfortable at all. However, what that does do is, because I'm gripping it further back on a sword that already is at like around a 7-inch point of balance, that makes the sword feel even more forward heavy. And this is a very forward heavy feeling sword. 7 inches, that's quite a lot. That's more than pretty much any long sword, for instance. But it's not ahistorical. It's not incorrect for this type of sword. Just by the very nature of them, they are more forward heavy. You've got such a broad blade. You've got distal taper here, but it still ends up around 2.5 millimeters thick, if I remember right. And with such a broad blade, there's a lot of meat out here. And there's not a ton of meat back here. So you're going to get a pretty forward point of balance. So what that means is this is a chopper. And also you're going to either want to use the body to stop the cut. Like if I'm doing this, when my arm hits my torso, it stops the cut. Or redirect the motion, keep the motion going. I'm trying not to be careful here because I don't want to hit my mantle. But overall, I don't have a lot of experience with Viking swords. I've reviewed one other one of the very first swords I ever reviewed. It wasn't even a video, it was on text, and it was the Windless Stickelstad, and I hated that sword. And this one feels a lot better than that one. And a good part of that is the distal taper. This sword has it. The Stickelstad I didn't have it, from what I remember. I mostly remember that I hated that sword. The point of balance was around 8 inches, something like that, and it just felt awful. But regardless, this isn't a review of the Stickelstad, it's a review of the Balaur Arms single-edged Viking sword. So it feels, I've used this terminology a lot when I describe how a sword feels. It feels right. Yes, it's point heavy. Yes, it tires the arm out pretty quickly, but that doesn't mean it doesn't feel right. It's the way this feels, it's the way this should feel. With not a whole lot of experience or education, it's really not that hard to tell when a sword feels right. All it really takes is 1 or 2 swords that you pick up and you're like, oh, that's what a sword's supposed to feel like. And after that, it at least for me, I think it's pretty easy to tell when a sword feels the way it should, even if I don't particularly like the handling. That's not to say I dislike the handling on this. It's just not my big cup of tea. It's not really the type of sword that I gravitate to. So the sword is a little bit flexible, not a lot, but with a single-edged sword, you generally don't have nearly as much flex as a double-edged. We can look at the point of percussion, and there is one. Some single-edged blades, you do this and you don't even see any vibrations pretty much. But it's right around here. I had the measurements up earlier. This feels like a good spot for the point of percussion. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any other Viking swords to compare this sword to. I might want to get one in the future. Something about the look of this sword is just incredibly appealing. And there's something appealing to it about cutting with it too, because it just feels so purpose-built. It feels like, yeah, this was designed as a weapon of war. And it's appealing in a way that I don't typically find Viking swords. So let's talk about potential improvements. Now, since this sword is discontinued, this section might be a little superfluous, but Cold Steel does have a very, very similar model. It could even be the exact same, and perhaps these could be applied to that model. So the first improvement is the edge. Now, I'm not talking about needing to ship it sharp. It would be nice, it would be great if you could ship it with one smooth bevel without needing a secondary bevel. But I understand that OTC is based in India. India has complex laws regarding exporting sharp swords. But a 2mm thick edge is just too much. Bring it down to 1mm. That would mean there's a whole lot less grinding that the sharpener needs to do at the end result to get a good bevel. The fact that you have to grind away so much metal to get this to be a good apple-seeded edge is problematic, especially because vendors could just put on a very quick, aggressive secondary bevel that's just going to be even worse for cutting than an apple-seeded edge. So a little bit thinner of an edge would be a big improvement. Secondly, if the pommel is one piece, I'd like to see it historically correct and be a two-piece. This is more of a if though, because I don't know for sure. And lastly, incredibly minor, I'd like to see the chape polished to the same finish as the hilt furniture. It just looks a little out of place to have the chape so shiny when the sword is sheathed. So bottom line, well, the sword isn't actually available, but I think it was well worth the price of $250 that I think Kult of Athena had it listed for. There's not a lot of well-done Viking swords in the budget range, let alone single-edge Viking swords. In fact, there's almost no single-edge Viking swords out there that I can think of besides this one, the Cold Steel one, and the Albion Berserker. So to see a single-edged Viking sword in a less than $300 price point that's done well, that's really good. That's something that is very attractive for the price. And they get a lot right here. Like, a lot of budget Viking swords get a lot of things wrong. They have the grip too long. They have incorrect geometry on the blade. They don't distal taper. There's a whole bunch of things that they get wrong. And this one gets it right. So to see that in a $250 sword, that's a great thing to see. I really like this sword for this price. Now, the Cold Steel one, I am 95% sure it's the same model. There might be a few differences here and there. For instance, the maker's mark isn't there. I think I've seen one where the wire in the pommel is not copper. Very minor differences. So if you can get the Cold Steel one for $260, I think it's probably worth the price as well. Kult of Athena has the Cold Steel for $320, and I think it is probably worth that price as well. Overall, it's a fun sword that cuts pretty well depending on the target you are looking at, and does so many things right that other budget Viking swords get wrong, that it really does fill a hole in the market. And I hope the Cold Steel one is the same way.